the timing of things, we change when we're ready. And I think there can be so much pressure around change, but our bodies have to be ready. Our nervous systems have to be ready. The moment needs to be right. And when it's like, yes, I feel like that's when I have chosen to go. But if something isn't that full yes or that full knowing, maybe the timing isn't right yet.
Okay, welcome back. Hello. It's the 500th episode of this podcast. I've done 500 of these, but it's just another day here. It's episode 6, I think, maybe 7. Around 6 of Comebacks, the new series we've been doing the last couple months. This week I'm talking to Amber Ray. She's the author of the somewhat new memoir called Loveable, and we recorded this about a year ago. It pains me to say, but it took a while to turn these out and start this new series, as you know, if you've been listening. And the timing is so interesting because listening back to these episodes was just kismet in terms of what we end up talking about and how it impacts what I've been considering now and makes me think about where I was then and the contrast and anyway, so I hope that it hits you at the right time too, like it did for me. But Amber and I talk about knowing when to leave, knowing when to stay, people pleasing, self-abandonment, why sometimes we choose relationships that feel safe because they don't require us to be vulnerable, learning to tolerate disappointment from others instead of self-abandoning all the time to avoid that, and how sometimes the scariest choice is actually what gives you the most freedom. So anyway, I love this conversation. Amber has an interesting way about talking about change that doesn't seem so overwhelming, like you have to become a different person overnight, but instead just make one right decision at a time, the next right decision, the next right action, and how clarity can come from action, which is really a through line of all these conversations over the Comeback series, which has been really helpful for me as I plot my own, dare I say, comeback. So here's my conversation with Amber Ray. Thank you so much for being here, and I'll talk to you at the end. One more quick thing before we start. I'm working on something new and I'm looking for someone to help me. So if you are extremely organized, good at managing logistics of projects, and want to be on the ground floor of something fun that I'm really excited about, and you'd like to work with me, email me, katie@letitoutwith3ts.com, or if you know somebody who might want to pass this along. Okay, here's the episode. I'd love to start by talking about timing when it comes to change. I heard you say on another podcast that we change when it's time and when our nervous system is ready. And you said that in the context of how you noticed that people were asking you if you wished that you'd left your previous marriage sooner, and you say no. Can you talk about that? And timing?
Yeah. And just a bit of context. So I was chatting with my friend, Vienna Farron. She's a therapist. She's Mindful MFT on Instagram. Her content is amazing. Highly recommend checking her out. And I remember telling her that because when I was walking down the aisle, how many years ago was this? I don't know how many years ago, but when I was walking down the aisle the first time and I was finally marrying my best friend, and we'd been together at that point for 7 years. We were together, I guess, for 7.5, because we were engaged for 7 of them. He proposed very quickly. But when I walked down the aisle, I knew it wasn't going to work out. And I had this feeling of like, I'm not sure how long this is going to last, but I guess we're going to have a great party. To which someone might ask, well, then, like, why the hell did you go through with it? Why would you marry someone if you had that much doubt? And, I think I felt a lot of guilt and shame about that for a while because, why was I leading him on? I had all these kind of questions around it. And she said something so poignantly. She said, well, your nervous system couldn't handle leaving in that moment. Your nervous system couldn't handle telling the 70 friends and family members who flew across the world to come to your wedding that it was being canceled. Your nervous system couldn't handle letting your friend down, hurting people you love, and the money that you spent on this wedding, all of the time and energy you had put into the relationship. Your nervous system wasn't ready to make that leap yet. And so of course, it was this feeling of like, oh gosh, I don't know how long this is going to last. But I also was contending with, but I really think we can figure it out. So, I was kind of holding both. And I wasn't yet ready to really realize that no, this is, I've been trying to make this work for far too long. So, I think when I say that I wish it wouldn't have ended sooner, I trust that life is, the timing of things, we change when we're ready. And I think there can be so much pressure around change, but our bodies have to be ready. Our nervous systems have to be ready. The moment needs to be right. And when it's like, yes, I feel like that's when I have chosen to go. But if something isn't that full yes or that full knowing, maybe the timing isn't right yet. And I'm not saying, because sometimes it'll be yes and I'm scared, but I think that the yes needs to be there.
As you're talking about this, I'm like turning it over in my brain and like experiences that I've had. I often think that we need to, especially early on in our first half of life, like touch the hot stove to learn lessons, or just like have experiences to have more empathy. And I know there's like a limit to that, but does that feel true in this case for you?
Yeah, I think my way of learning is definitely trial and error. I'm a person who will like throw myself into the fire, whether it's creatively in business. I mean, we literally left Brooklyn yesterday after living there for 5 months with a baby. We had a year-long lease and we realized, whoa, and we got pushed out of LA by the fire. So we had this very abrupt change and decided to, okay, I guess let's go back to New York. We were in Brooklyn very quickly. We're like, Brooklyn is not right. And instead of forcing it and trying to make it fit for us, we decided to, figure out how to get out of our lease, which we did, and move somewhere else. So, I think we didn't know until we were living it. And I'm very much like you have to feel and experience it to know. And so I think in some ways, yeah, like I was walking down the aisle, like I'm not sure how long this is going to last, but I also didn't know if being married would change things.
Yeah.
Just like I had lived in Brooklyn for a decade, but I didn't know if living in Brooklyn with a baby would feel good until I was there. And I was like, no, this doesn't feel good. This doesn't feel aligned. And, I think my yeses have often come from my like, this isn't it. And I have to feel that this isn't it and move from kind of misalignment to misalignment. And that has helped me find alignment, if that makes sense.
No, it does completely. And I think that there's been, like, I can think of a relationship that I was in where I knew I just had a feeling long before it ended that, like, it wasn't correct. And I just put it somewhere else, and it wasn't so conscious as I was like lying to myself. I just like, it was really inconvenient that was the case. And also I just knew that I wanted to stay longer. And I think maybe that could be pathologized as like a negative thing, but I don't know. I think everything happens when it's meant to an extent. And also, I guess that brings me to another point that you've made that I really relate to is like, and it sounds like you did that in this case of like knowing when to leave and knowing when to go and knowing when to stay. And around change and readiness, you talk about how we all are on one side or the other, and of being someone who stays and someone who leaves quickly, and that speed of things. And I have a tendency to stay too long. And this tendency to linger too long can be debilitating, it can be hard in some ways. But then, at the same time, no wonder I found it so comforting when you're like, you change when your nervous system is ready. Like, you can almost make that an excuse if you need to. You have to like know what advice is for you and what isn't. And so I'd love to know like what helped you know what side of that you're on in any given situation. And does that tendency change depending on what life area it's in for you?
I think it can absolutely, because there are parts of my life where like I was maybe in my career, if something wasn't right, I was very quick to leave. I was like, nah, this isn't it. But I think when it came to love and relationships, I tended to overstay because I was afraid of hurting the person's feelings, because I cared about them, because I wasn't maybe over pleasing and over harmonizing situations and didn't want anyone to get hurt. Because when it came to my career, I think I felt less like I had to take care of the other person's feelings. But, I think the question to ask is, why am I staying, or why do I want to leave? And that why can be very revealing, because, maybe why I want to leave is because, let's say, I'm afraid of having the hard conversation, or this is feeling really intimate and I'm scared, or maybe it's I want to stay because I don't want to let the other person down, or I'm afraid of rocking the boat. Those are all reasons I don't think that are necessarily serving our growth or our expansion. But if the staying is like, I'm staying because there's more growth to do here, or I'm staying because I'm still learning about love, or I'm staying because I want to be here and I love this person, or I love this thing that I'm doing and I'm moved and it's expanding my capacity. Like, what are the reasons why? And I think so long as we can get on board with that why, and it's actually serving our evolution, then like that's the whole point. But when the why becomes fear and discomfort and uncertainty, then I'm a big fan of change before you're ready.
Yeah.
Because maybe it's leaping into the uncertainty or taking a step into the unknown, or, clarity comes through action and mistakes are lessons. So, I think it's a fine line that if growth is our goal, if expansion is a value that is important to us, which path is going to move us closer to that?
I think things move quickly. I've found when I can just let go and move on and, fail fast, essentially. And I know you in 2010 quit your job and you sold everything and you moved from Silicon Valley to New York in 48 hours. So that was a quick move. And then
that was very quick.
Yeah. And then 4 years ago, while you were married, you met someone who cracked you open and you made a giant change at that point in your life too. How did both of those threshold experiences force you to confront self-abandonment and move into the next version of yourself?
Yeah, I guess I'm a slow but fast person because I remember like contemplating for 9 months, should I leave my job in tech in San Francisco? I feel this calling to New York. I don't know why I feel like calling to New York. I haven't been to New York yet, but I feel like I need to go. And then I like had one conversation with one person one day, and then 48 hours, and then that made everything crystal clear. And then 48 hours later, I had sold everything and was there. And then I was in a 9-year relationship where I spent a good majority of it kind of questioning, is he really my person? And then I one day looked into the eyes of a stranger and had this instant knowing of, oh, this is what love is supposed to feel like. And as crazy as it seemed in the moment, like, I'm pretty sure he's my person. And within 6 weeks had left my marriage, left what my husband and I were building together, my then husband, packed my life and moved to LA. And I, had committed my life to this stranger who is now not so much a stranger, but we committed our lives to each other and we hadn't even kissed. And so, I think there's like a slow incubation period, but when there is that like knowing of full yes, then I move very quickly. And I guess I don't move until I have it. And I wish like if Erin Claire was on right now, of course, human design, I'm like a sacral authority. And like, I feel like manifesting generator, she'd be like, oh, this all makes sense based on your human design.
Yeah, for sure.
But, I think going back to the why around like, why do we stay? When I was on the other side of this 9-year marriage, I realized that, I had chosen to marry someone who was my best friend and never my romantic partner. And we had a sexless relationship. And even though we were good friends and had a good time together and he was a good person, he was, very much not my person, which as someone whose work in the world is about helping people and like, I was hoping that I was embodying authenticity and following your truth and all of that. It was very puzzling to me that I had been so inauthentic in love and had been lying to myself and convincing myself that the relationship I was in, like the reality of our relationship was very different from the story I told myself about it. And so, the question became then of like, how the hell did I get here? And it was only when I connected the dots of my past and understood childhood trauma and abandonment and wounding with my father leaving and then dying. And then, my relationship with my mom, and then like understood that it had me realize, oh, of course I chose love that I believed was safe and would never leave. A friend, is safe and won't leave. But, all that to say, it was only through looking back that I was able to see these like patterns of self-abandonment and putting my needs last and not even actually knowing what my needs are and being so afraid of hurting my then husband that I was so willing to hurt myself and disappoint myself. So, I think that's a huge thread for women in particular, and sometimes a reason why we stay. And then I think is sometimes the why that doesn't serve us. If we're finding ourselves in dynamics or situations because self-abandonment is easier than making the self-honoring choice, that's, I think, when change is very much required.
Yeah, completely. And I think you said too, in either in the book or in one of the other interviews I listened to, but in your first marriage, the safety of that allowed you to be more risky in your career. Can you talk about like what that looked like? Because I feel like, to your point of what you said, it's what I was saying earlier too. Like sometimes there are reasons why we linger longer, and obviously we can use that to rationalize to a point too. And I don't want to do that, but sometimes it is actually true. Like you said, looking back, were you able to see that?
Yeah, I think our relationship in many ways, because it was a friendship, was this safe container. And in that safety that I felt in our friendship, I was able to explore a lot creatively. And I think because I wasn't experiencing pleasure, in the traditional sense of like sexual, we weren't having sex in the relationship, that like pleasure piece was missing. And so I like really pursued what gave me pleasure in my creativity and career. And I think actually through that, not to say that I couldn't do that if I was in a satisfied relationship, because I feel like now I'm married and we have a very healthy sex life and there's a lot of pleasure and I'm still pursuing pleasure. But I do feel like it allowed me to like be bold and take risks and like really find, because I don't think I knew yet what brought me alive and what made me tick and like what turned me on creatively. I did have a safe space to do that. And I'm very grateful, when we were ending our relationship, I didn't see it or ending our marriage. I didn't see it as a failure. I, was really grateful for who I got to become in the container of our love. I just think that we both had outgrown the relationship, but we were too afraid to say goodbye because we were friends and because we cared deeply about each other.
Yeah. That's just like hitting me really hard. I think we end up putting our energy into other areas because of what we're not getting in certain areas. And yeah, I just like deeply, you were able to put to words things that I've felt and didn't even realize that I felt in so much of your work in this book. And yeah, it really puts a mirror up into your face to realize things. And this is one of them. And you talk about how, and you said this like today too, this tendency of turning friends into romantic partners to protect yourself. And I think with that, like before hearing you say it, I guess I didn't even realize that's like the only thing I've ever done. Like I didn't even really know that there's a difference between friendship and romance. Or maybe I do, but I didn't want to admit that. And I guess how did you realize that pattern in yourself? And can a friendship, can there be someone, you make the distinction of like turning friends into romantic partners and then like having a romantic partner, and then, obviously, or I'm assuming like you're also have a friendship relationship with that person too, but can you have like a healthy romance with someone who is a friend and then vice versa? Like how did you learn that distinction in yourself, and what does that actually look like in practice?
Yeah. So just to add a little like background for me, because, I opened the book with this, but one of my first memory of meeting my father is I was 8 years old and he was in a hospital in a trauma care center because he had a traumatic brain injury. And I remember walking into the room and being so excited to meet him because here was this person who I had known about. I knew I had a dad. I just didn't know who he was or if he knew me. And I had all these questions, and I was finally meeting him. And I so desperately wanted for him to be able to love me and attune to me and look into my eyes. And, I would see little girls with their dads, and I wanted that. But of course, he had a traumatic brain injury, so I couldn't reach him. And I just remember wanting desperately for him, to be able to see me, and he couldn't. And then that was the pattern I played out, as I picked partners who I couldn't reach from like a depth and an emotional level. I feel like I'm not answering your question, but that's what came up in the answer.
No, you are.
And then I think with that, I think the distinction for me is, a friend can certainly become a romantic partner so long as the friend is also a lover. And I think I chose friends who I didn't necessarily have sexual chemistry with because that somehow felt safer. Because I thought that, I would need to unpack that a little bit more, like why exactly was it the sex that made it the thing? But like, we're friends, there's security here, so they won't leave. But I think the distinction is so long as the friend is then the lover, then I think it can be a beautiful thing. John, my husband now, I'd say he's my best friend, but he's also like, we have, it's so much more than that. And when we're choosing friends, again, from the place of, I don't want to get hurt, or I'm avoiding intimacy and being vulnerable, or all of the reasons that we, don't have to reveal ourselves so that we don't have to experience more pain and longing. Because for me, again, the familiarity of looking at a dad who I couldn't reach, I then chose partners who I couldn't reach, and choosing friends, you can't access all of them. And so I was just continuing these patterns of my past. And they say you like marry your mom or dad. And I think it's true because we choose familiarity because it's comfortable, but familiarity isn't always healthy for us.
Oh my gosh, completely. And yeah, this is another one that like, I really feel like your work and what you share in your book is like really put a lot of mirrors up in my face of like things that I need to shift or grow or am actively trying to do those things. And I just find everything that you've navigated through this being so inspiring, and it can feel daunting, I guess, to look at all of this and even, kind of intense to the point where it's like, oh, I don't want to know what I know here, because it's inconvenient. And it can be daunting of like, can I even do it? Like, do I even have enough? There's so much change and growth that I need to do the grooves are so deep here. Can I even do it? And something that you said somewhere was about how, I think you said like we're wounded in relationships and we heal in relationships. And I really loved that. And it feels true of like, I don't have to have this all figured out to be in a relationship. And it feels very true for me of like the time that I was in a relationship, I learned so much and grew so much. It's very easy to not grow when you're not having to compromise or be mirrored by someone else all the time, and when you're isolated. And so one of the things that you talked about too of like voicing your fears in your relationship of like feeling inexperienced or like sexually inexperienced even, and you talk about feeling disconnected from your sexuality after years of repression, and saying that and like voicing that. Can you talk about what helped you to realize that, and then what the process of voicing that gave you, I guess?
Yeah. Well, freedom requires restraint. And so I feel like people always want to feel free, but in order to become free, we have to realize what we're breaking free from. And so, I think for me, here I was on the other side of a 9-year sexless relationship. I show up in LA. I've committed my life to this person who I had this instant knowing is my person. And he's picking me up at LAX, and we've committed our lives to each other, but not yet kissed. And I remember I was on the plane to LA, and I was so deeply proud of myself because on one hand, I had just kind of blown up my life, but blown up the good girl harmony myth and the self-abandonment and all of the things. And I think I blew it up, but I also did it with love and care and transparency. And so I was like, yes, I did the thing. And also I was overwhelmed with all of these fears of, oh God, what if I can't measure up in the bedroom? I feel so disconnected from this part of myself. John is not, sexually repressed. He's very in touch with that part of himself. What if I can't satisfy him in bed? And I was just like overwhelmed with all these fears and very annoyed because, here I had just done this big thing and now I like got to go be with my person. But of course, this was the next stage of growth, I guess. And, I found it helpful to just lean into vulnerability and voice how I was feeling because otherwise, like if I didn't, I felt paralyzed and disconnected and out of touch. And, I wanted to also be in a relationship with someone who we could hold space for the hard things and have the hard conversations and voice honestly and meet each other with like compassion and curiosity. And so I didn't realize it at the time, but it was like all of these tests for us to like figure out how we can love and care for each other in the way that we needed. But, I remember when we first made love, I was like so nervous. Arms, like he'll describe it. He's like, you stood there like a deer in headlights with your like arms pinned to your sides. And I like can remember it vividly. And afterwards I was like, oh God, I was so in my head. I was like, I feel like that was terrible, or I was terrible. And I had this overwhelming fear that John would leave. And I realized two things. One, of course, this is why I didn't choose relationships where I desired the other person, because I chose dynamics where I wasn't afraid if the person would leave. And now I'm with someone whom I'm so afraid could leave me. And all of my abandonment anxieties and woundings are coming to the surface. And that was far too scary or painful to look at. So of course I chose relationships where I wouldn't have to feel any of this, because this feels shitty and scary and overwhelming. But then what was the edge of growth? The edge of growth was, which, I was grateful that John was like such a willing participant in. It was like to voice my insecurities and say, like, I say what was alive in me and let that, letting my insides be visible, be part of the practice of our relationship. And, I think it's a line here because I don't want to emotionally dump. I think it was important that I was in therapy and doing my own processing, but also being able to like trust that the relationship was a safe space for us to discuss the things that were, alive. But it wasn't that John wasn't the person I needed to unpack and process and understand my trauma and find, come home to myself and find security from within. Like I had to do that work, but you can do that work on yourself alongside being in the container where, had I have not chosen someone that I desired, I would have never felt these things and I would have never expanded into this kind of growth. I would have never, unleashed my sexuality more and gotten in touch with myself and learned how to have these hard, brave conversations and all the things that I've learned in our relationship. By choosing safe relationships, I was also avoiding all of the freedom and the growth that comes on the other side.
Wow. Yeah, it's really cool of you to share about this. And another thing that we share is you've written about this as well, of making yourself smaller than your body wants to be, and all of those things I feel like could be distilled down to control and validation. It's never about the person I realize after, it's about what I thought it would bring me or what it would make it mean if they picked me. Or it's not about being a size 0. It's about the confidence I get from that temporarily, that, what I thought that would bring me. I feel like this with the relationship stuff, I think I do that too. I pick people who, because I think sex and intimacy are by nature not in our control. Like they're very hard to capture and control, and it's easier to almost avoid that and try. So how does control kind of become the through line through all of this? Is that true for you?
Maybe it's control of other people's perception of me. I think eating disorders and Adderall and all of that were about me believing I needed to look a certain way to be worthy of love. And so if I can control myself to fit what I think is this guy or even society's perception of beauty, then I will be okay and then I will be loved. And so I think all of that for me stemmed from deep seated feelings of unworthiness and unlovability for who I am, and thinking that I needed to, yeah, control myself to be a certain way or to look a certain way or to act a certain way, be who the object of my, someone who I was interested in, what would make them love me and not leave me. So it was fear of abandonment mixed with how I thought what would give me love. And that, of course, was all outside of me because I hadn't yet learned what it looked like to actually love myself.
Yeah. And I really relate to that too, of like how you said that, of like you didn't feel worthy to have love without being a certain size. I almost feel like I'm not worthy to even feel feelings, like to be in my body unless it's a certain size, or to like feel emotions. Because if I'm feeling sadness or grief or discomfort of any kind, like the first kind of line of defense before I even like feel the emotion is like, well, it would be better if you're smaller. And then when I have been smaller, I'm like, I don't have that to rely on, because I'm like, well, I'm small, so I can feel it. So which is so silly and backwards, but it's funny how our brains do this to protect us, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And culture doesn't help, because culture, it's not, I didn't just like somehow out of thin air believe that if I looked a certain way, I'd be worthy of love. Our entire culture supports that belief.
Right.
And that's evolved, but the beauty industry, Hollywood, everything that appears to show what is beautiful and loved represents, like, yes, if you're a smaller size, you're more lovable, you're more attractive, you'll get more things, people will, the long list of things has been what culture says. And so no wonder we've been indoctrinated into these false beliefs.
Completely. I think it's cyclical, but there have been periods, about 5-10 years ago when it kind of felt like there was more awareness around that, and culturally we were moving in a more accepting direction of that. And I feel like it's completely gone the other way more recently. And I think aging is like another one that it's new for me. And I knew, it felt like it was just kind of looming. And I knew I probably wasn't going to be great at it, since I've been so bad at the body image stuff. But now it's here, and the other one's as strong as ever. So it's just like time to look at this stuff and actually change it. Do you have anything that was like especially helpful for you in letting go of these beliefs? I have the awareness. I know enough about why I am the way I am, but I think I'm at the point where I'm like, all right, it's better now for me to, I would prefer to talk about why all day long, but I've done that enough, and I know that now it needs to be what instead of why, and changing and action. Yeah, I guess it goes back to the beginning of like, rather than being a stayer, being a mover, or a go. Like, how did you in this area learn that?
I think it was the shift from looking good to feeling good, which I can so easily synthesize now, and I didn't even necessarily realize I was doing it slowly over the years. But I think my attention shifted from outward acceptance and how do I look and do I look good, to inner alignment and how do I feel. And, where I may have popping Adderall and not really eating made me feel like shit. It disconnected me from my intuition and my creativity. And honestly, Adderall, I think I was taking it until I was in I can't remember exactly, maybe mid-20s. And it had me so disconnected. And when I slowly weaned myself off of it, I remember my creativity rushing through, and I started writing again, and I started hearing my intuition again. And I was like, wow, this feels good. Wow, hello, human. And so I think it was like, as I started to focus on the feeling good and, not the outward focus, but the inner focus, and I felt benefit from that, I had to experience oh yeah, okay. But it was like, ooh, this, I feel alive because I wrote, or ooh, instead of going on the elliptical for 50 minutes hard and thinking that's what I need to look good, I went on a hike and that felt really good. And I just started doing the things that felt good. And then I think that just like was just got my hormones, all the oxytocin is going and, all those like feel good hormones. And it just like built and built and built and became almost this like thing that I was on like the feel good train now rather than the look good train. And once it started, I was going fast. And like now I like would think back to like, oh God, I would never want to do that look good thing because that made me feel like shit. And I've found that the more that I like did things that feel good for me, my like body naturally like went to the weight it was supposed to be. And like things just sort of like I think my nervous system was settled and I wasn't externally searching. And there was like a peace that then came over me. And I think that like, I don't know, it just like, a different way of being.
Well, again, inspiring. I love that. Were there moments where you decided that that's what you wanted to do, but then, had a bad day where you weren't feeling as good and just wanted to return to what you were doing before? How did you talk yourself if that happened? Like, how did you remember and stay on course? Because I think that's often my problem is I know what I need and I might start doing it, but then I end up stopping halfway through or not actually. I end up going back to what's known and what's comfortable. How did you push yourself through that?
I think being careful not to shame spiral, because I think if we catch ourselves doing something that may not feel as good, if we start to move into, oh no, I'm doing that thing, this is bad, and we start to get into the story of it, then we start spiraling and then it just makes things worse. I always just try and focus on the next right decision. And so, if I had too many glasses of wine one night and was like, oh shit, why did I have that third glass of wine? That made me feel like shit. And particularly now with a baby, like sleep, I like 2 glasses of wine is max. If I have that third glass and I'm not sleeping properly through the night, it's like the next day does not feel good. And I could beat myself up. But if I'm just like, okay, what's the next right decision? And I make the next right decision for myself, then it like keeps me moving forward instead of harping on the past.
Yeah, that's key. And something I'm constantly reminding myself of. So I heard somebody say once, like, fail fast, like just to be able to continue. And I think your work underlines this a lot. And it's about tolerating a broader spectrum of discomfort when making a decision that, in every respect, but especially in making a decision that is correct for you, but also, and you talk about this a lot too, disappoints others. How do you support yourself when you know that you've disappointed someone else? How do you stay with the choice and stay with the feeling without disassociating?
Yeah. As someone who was that over harmonizer, overstayer, I realized that my pattern was to seek their approval and not disappoint them. And so in that, I would disappoint myself. And so the edge for me was, instead of tolerating my own disappointment or my own unfulfillment, it was to tolerate the discomfort of them being disappointed in me because I did something that was authentic to me. And so it's like, instead, I would just like so long put up with being dissatisfied with my own choices. And I was like, wait, I need to flip this over. I need them to be dissatisfied with my choices if I'm satisfied with my choices. And that, I didn't have to be like harsh or unkind about things, but I need to make sure that I wasn't disappointing myself. And so the tolerance there is the discomfort of their disapproval, because it's very uncomfortable for me. Like if someone I care about is disappointed or disapproves of something that they've done, and I've gotten more comfortable with it now, where I'm actually like, okay, people might have feelings about this. That's okay. Those feelings can exist and I can still do what's right for me. I mean, the book I released, I talk a lot about the mother-daughter relationship, and it was uncomfortable for my mom. My mom would prefer if I hadn't have written about those things. But it was really important to me. It was an important part of my journey, learning to have healthy boundaries, learning to process the pain of my past and understand and unpack my childhood trauma. And I believe that when we do that healing work for ourselves, we heal in all directions. And so even though some of those scenes and memories and those experiences of mine were uncomfortable for my mom and she would prefer not to have them in there, I knew it was the right and true thing for me to say. And I also knew that I would be healing and beneficial to others. So I decided that even though this is going to make my mom uncomfortable, I'm still going to do it. Trusting that, her and I could have the conversations that we would need to have, or trusting that that part would be figured out. So I think that's a good example. Or that, there are even times with my, I've had creative partners where they think that the decision I'm making is for whatever reason, and they're the way they see things, not the right choice. But I have this like feeling of knowing of like, no, this is the right choice for me. And I think we have to make self-honoring choices. And again, we don't have to be reckless or unkind, but we can say, I hear you, thank you, and this is what's true for me. And so I'm going to move in that direction.
Yeah, completely. It's direct communication doesn't come naturally for me, and I like a lot of what we've been discussing today, like I know what I need to do, I'm just not doing it, or I'm doing it more slowly than I wish that I was, which can be infuriating, and I can see how my failures to communicate directly or people pleasing can really be infuriating to others. But it's taking time to switch the pattern and like learning to write with a non-dominant hand. And while I'm in process with that, it was interesting to hear you talk about this in the context of friendship. And you were saying somewhere that you could see a friend of yours still in this pattern that you could relate to at some point in your life. Yeah. Of, people pleasing often makes things more messy. You observed this person kind of giving you these half-truths that come from people pleasing, and you described how it feels in friendship to be on the receiving end of someone people pleasing and abandoning themselves in the process. And you described a friend who people pleases to avoid upsetting others, but in doing so ends up kind of upsetting others because they're being unclear, and that's exhausting to be on the other side of. So with that, obviously the goal for that person is to learn to be able to honor themselves and speak more clearly, but that might take time, and you can model it, of course, which is, probably the best thing you can do for them. But are there any other ways that you've learned to support friends who are still in that pattern and not abandon yourself in the process of doing that?
A few things come up. One is, I think more and more I'm learning to like stay on my yoga mat and not try to like get on someone else's yoga mat with them. And I just have to like live and embody it myself. But I also can, name when something I can name like, hey, love, just want to like, can I like, are you open to me sharing something that I'm noticing? And, if you have that safety in friendship, I think a dialogue can help. Because what's interesting about, the people pleasing is that, yes, we don't want to let the other person down, and we think it's outward focused, but oftentimes people pleasing is like, we don't want to experience discomfort and conflict. So it's like our avoidance of something. We don't want to be someone that someone doesn't like. And it's actually not to say selfish, but it's a self-focused thing, even though we present it as other focused. And I can say that as being someone who is a people pleaser. And so, I don't know if we can do that. More and more, I'm like, I can't do the work for people, and I can't lead them there until they're ready. But I more try to model it myself, actually stay in my own lane. But, of course, with safe friendship, I think we can say like, hey, or like, when you said this, I sensed what you were really saying was this, but because you didn't voice it, it like, created some, like, I'm trying to think of an example. A friend was like in town and she was staying with another friend, and I wanted to have some one-on-one time with her, but she was like afraid to tell the other friend that she wanted one-on-one time with me because she didn't want the other friend to feel left out. But instead of speaking honestly to both of us, like she ended up saying, oh, well, our friend always wants to be involved in everything, which wasn't the truth. She just couldn't say to her other friend, like, hey, I want to go spend an hour with, So it was just, I was like, it just created unnecessary drama and confusion. And this was a conversation that we had. So I think it's like I think the thing is to like voice it from your eye experience and the impact it has on you. And also like invite like, hey, you know you can always be honest and direct and transparent with me because I'm a safe place for that. Because oftentimes where the pleasing comes from is like it wasn't safe for me growing up to speak honestly about how I was feeling. It wasn't safe for me to like sometimes I did have to avoid conflict and I did have to be in harmony because if I wasn't, it would cause unnecessary chaos and I didn't want to deal with that. And so it became this like protective layer that I would wear. And so I think like creating safety in those pleasing friendships has allowed the pleaser to be able to like please less, if that makes sense.
Yes, completely. That makes so much sense, and it was really helpful for me to even hear what it feels like to be on the receiving end of that because I have been as well, and I think it's just helpful to put yourself in the shoes of the person that you're, making things more complicated for without, it's not intentional, but the impact is still there. I think you described that really well. I could talk to you forever. I have some rapid fire questions, but before I do those, I'd love to talk about journaling and writing and self-honesty a little bit because I know journaling has been really important to you too for pretty much your whole life. And you talk about how being honest with the page makes you more honest in your life. Is there a prompt that you like to return to when you're feeling like you need a little bit of a push in a certain direction or you're stuck somewhere? Is there a prompt that you give yourself or to others?
I think a prompt that I love if I'm feeling stuck is like I often dialogue with my parts and I love to dialogue with my intuition and knowing. But I'll ask like, hey, intuition, what do I need to know? And then I kind of hand the microphone to knowing or intuition and almost let it speak to me through the page. And I did that also when I was like stuck writing my book. I would be like, hey, book, it's me, Amber. What do you need me to know? Or even like, if I'm struggling with shame or fear, hey, fear, it's me, Amber. What do you need to know? And just giving that part of me or hey, part of me that feels stuck. What do you need me to know? And when I give that part of voice, there tends to be a lot of wisdom there. So that's my favorite prompt in those situations.
Yeah, no, that's so good. When I was prepping for this, I listened to you on a very old podcast episode from like I think maybe 2014, and you said something in it that I wrote down, and it really connected with this current iteration of where I am and maybe where you are. And I was going to read it, but I actually have the clip. So,
Oh
and
boy.
now I can't actually remember what it was because to be honest, we were going to record this a little bit ago and now it's going to be like a little surprise for both of us, but I'm just going to play it really quick if that's okay. Okay. I hope it works that you can hear it. There might be an echo, but we'll see.
In terms of my creative process and my creative rhythm, I'd say there's probably four things. The first is really showing up, and that's the symbol of scheduling and prioritizing it. If it's not on my calendar, it's not going to get done. And so from when I typically wake up around 9 a.m. till noon, I have nothing on my calendar, and that's when I really do my morning ritual. I grab my green juice, shot of wheatgrass, I light a fire, I turn music on. So that actually goes into the second thing, which is ambiance and energy, which like for me, it's music, candles, fire. I have this cat, I have this mantra on my fireplace. It's creating the environment that makes me feel alive, and then showing up to actually perform the task and prioritizing it, and knowing that Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday are typically my super creative days, and so typically I don't schedule any appointments. I'm making a special exception for you. And everything goes in rhythm. So like November was I literally met with close to no people because I was in this hole of finishing basically the final touches on a book that I'm working on, and I really have to focus on that. But now that I've kind of close that chapter, I'm able to open myself up a little more.
I'll just offer you this. I think what you say next is like the part I actually wanted to play, but I'll just remind you it's about what inputs that make you feel most alive, like knowing what the inputs are, and that allows for the outputs in your writing. And so all of that I loved, and I guess now that you heard that, what does that feel like to hear this like past version of yourself?
Makes me laugh because now with a child, to think that I would have 9 to 12 as like, I just had such free, limited time and space. And I think at that season, I was trying to build a writing practice and get things going. It's interesting to hear now because I don't need inputs to have output, like the output of writing now. I just show up on the page and I start writing. So the only thing I need is pen and paper. Yeah. And I guess it's cool to be like, oh, wow, I've created such a pattern with my writing, and I guess a confidence and a curiosity where I can just show up and write and trust that's enough. I don't have time for all the extras. I don't need the shot of wheatgrass. And I was like, what fireplace and cat? I'm like, I'm trying to place where I was in this moment. But yeah, I think creativity, we all have to build our muscle and get things going. And I think I have a strong enough writing muscle at this point where, and also you have a baby and I sometimes have 5 minutes to write. I kind of take what I can get and I just show up and start writing.
Oh, I love that. And yeah, thank you. I just thought it was, I really liked the part about, you have inputs and outputs, but I also love that like sometimes you don't need any of that and it's just about sitting down and going, and it can be both ways. And
totally.
I really loved that. Okay, the iteration of the show that I'm, doing next is really about comebacks and coming back to yourself and figuring out like what the next phase looks like for you. So, now that you've written Loveable and you've reframed your story and had, several reinventions, but, the biggest ones recently you talked about in this book, what is next? Is there another new beginning that's beginning to take shape for you? Or even if you just were going to describe what it feels like in one word or phrase, what do you think is the next sort of pivot or comeback that's brewing for you?
I'm launching a Substack soon, and I think the seeds of that Substack, I think, are connected to my next book. So that's very exciting. It's all around this. The name of the Substack is If I'm Being Honest. And so it's really this theme of honesty, both like, if I'm being honest, I think this was my first memoir, this last book. I love personal essay writing. And so leaning more into that and that being the space for that, but also encouraging in others that practice of self-honesty and to look more honestly at themselves and their lives. And I've even been playing with this idea of like encouraging an honesty experiment. So all still early stages, but that is blooming, or like not blooming, the seeds are being planted for that right now. And then, I just moved to a new place where we're living in Sag Harbor, and we're like near the ocean and the water, and it's nature, and I'm excited for that. So I'm excited for also the new season of life as my son's about to turn 1 and about to be walking. I think there's a lot in bloom.
Oh, that's so exciting. And again, like, congrats on the book, and thank you so much for writing it and everything that you shared here. And I'm so happy to know you, and I'm so grateful that you took the time to talk to me here. And yeah, and stoked to read the Substack when that's out. And yeah, and happy birthday to your son. Thank you again so much for doing this. Thank you. Is there anything else that you wish that I would have asked that you never get to talk about, or that you want to say before we go?
I feel like you really, your level of research, very impressed with. No one's pulled a clip from 2012 before. I don't think I have, closing words. I'll be honest. I think what the phrase "we heal in all directions" is coming up. But I think just, encouraging those listening to look in the mirror and be willing to like face hard truths and know that on the other side of them, tremendous freedom and liberation awaits.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This was great. I'm really grateful that we did it. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Of course. Thank you for having me. This was a lot of fun. I loved how just like organic this conversation was. So thank you.
All right, that was my episode with Amber Ray. Thank you so much for listening all the way to the end. Let me know what you thought. Send us a message on Instagram or wherever. And she mentioned her Substack, which you should definitely check out, and you should definitely subscribe, and you should definitely get a hard copy of her book. And I'll also mention mine, Let It Out Lists on Substack. The link is in the show notes. I would love to see you there. I've been working on this one that I've been writing that 2 of my friends have read and keep reworking it. So who knows when you'll see one from me, but I hope you do soon. All right. Thank you again for listening, and I will talk to you next week. We never did the deep breath, but are we doing that anymore? Let's do it right now. Inhale. Let it out. All right. Talk to you soon. Thanks again for being here. Bye-bye.